another video, and again about nutrition. So we kind of touched up on of the videos that if I were to work with guys, nutrition would be my last things that I would touch up on them, because they just want to deadlift 6 plates and bench 3 plates and this and that. So nutrition comes in very, very last because, hey, let's just get to work kind of thing. But for women, more often than not, nutrition might be the biggest things that gives them results and maybe holds them into that area where actually they stick to it because they can get immediate results. And so what are your thoughts about setting a nutrition plan that is goal specific? And essentially, most women, like we have discussed before, they will just want to jump on a calorie deficit because they want to look leaner, more defined, toned, and so on and so forth. So where do you start? We already touched up on how to determine your maintenance and whatnot. What is the next step?
Yeah, the video last week, we talked about the different equations I use to determine your maintenance caloric intake. Those equations give us our basal metabolic rate, which is basically our body's energy needs at rest. But we still now need to consider, what does your daily life look like? What does your activity look like, etc. Because we need to add a multiplier to get the correct energy intake to make sure that we are starting at that theoretical maintenance. So what I do with clients is the response to my assessment forms, I get an idea of what does their lifestyle look like. Are they a sedentary desk job? Are they an esthetician, a high-powered lawyer in the courtroom all day on her feet, maybe a trainer? All these things need to be factored in. There's millions of charts people can look at online to determine the physical activity level. And I always input that. And I usually use somewhere between that 1.2 to 1.5-ish multiplier, only because I actually because my clients have hired me to take control of nutrition, training, supplements, pharmaceuticals, etc. So I have my hands in everything. So I actually calculate their energy output based on the exercise I'm going to have them doing. So I don't use the physical activity multipliers as you'd see them on a chart, because I actually separately calculate the energy output needs. But in general, that's what you're going to find. It's just a multiplier. Your basal metabolic rate times 1.2, 1.3, 75, 1.5, whatever it is. And then you have to add the thermic effect of food, which is another anywhere from 10 to 20%. It's a long-winded way of just basically ensuring there's adequate nutrients for a theoretical maintenance. Maintenance meaning your body is going to stay the way it currently is. Every female client that I've had come through my door in 20 years has wanted to change the way their body is. So we now have to adjust that. If the goal is fat loss, which 9 times out of 10 it is, we need to input an energy deficit. How I go about determining an energy deficit depends on a lot of things. It can come strictly from a reduction in the energy intake, so the food eaten. It can come from an increase of the energy output, like the activity, or any combination of the two. And it really just is going to be, how lean are they already? What does their activity level look like? What does their lifestyle look like? There's just no general way to say this is the best approach. But for those wanting a quick ballpark idea, the equation that we did talk about last week, the only one last week that actually gave the theoretical maintenance right off the bat, was body weight times 14. If you just want to ballpark it, body weight times 14 is your theoretical maintenance. So from there, now you have to determine a deficit. Typically, I like to keep female clients at the theoretical calculated maintenance until I've witnessed 2 menstrual cycles, which we've talked about in the past, because I want to be able to compare luteal to luteal and follicular to follicular phases, so I can get an idea of the body weight trends from water retention, etc. After I've done that, we implement a deficit. And I would say the leaner the female is, the smaller the deficit should be to help preserve lean tissue. So anywhere from 10 to 20% is a good starting point. So you're literally going to take your calculated maintenance calories minus 20%, give or take, and there's your deficit.
So when you talk about thermic effect of food, do you look into per meal or in total? because we often hear about, hey, you need to have protein every single meal at a certain amount to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and whatnot, and all these kind of things. Do you take that in account as well, or is it something like this might be like a thing where people go, hey, can I just eat once a day or twice a day and still get same results as someone who eats 5-6 times a day?
When I do that, I calculate the thermic effect of food right from the beginning, and it's just incorporated into the daily caloric needs. And then the daily caloric needs are divided amongst however many meals the individual is going to be eating. I don't recalculate anything or get too finicky. I don't think it's necessary. You're just looking for averages over time. The higher the protein intake of the diet, the higher the thermic effect of food is. I generally don't monitor that stuff overly close unless I have an extreme case. Typically, I just put in the thermic effect of food somewhere around 10 to 15%, and that's good enough. But the amount of times you're going to eat through the day, that's going to become very specific to the individual, because as a coach, I want to make sure that the training and nutritional protocols we put in place are sort of catering to the female's lifestyle. Like, we have busy professional females, they don't have time necessarily to stop and eat 6, 7, 8 times a day. So I get a feel for what their schedule looks like, and I talk to them and say, how many times a day can we eat? Ideally, it's more than 2. Could you get away with 2? Of course, you could get away with 1. Is it ideal? Definitely not, but it's still going to be fine. I would like to see 3 or 4. Typically, I find with a professional female that's working a relatively normal 9 to 5-ish type of job, 4 meals seems to work really well, almost across the board. They have time for breakfast in the morning. They have time to eat once or twice during their work day, and then they have time again to eat at night. But 3 would be perfectly fine. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the calories over the meals. And then, of course, if you're working with performance goals and people that are looking to, dot I's and cross T's with their last little bit of percentage they're trying to milk out of themselves, you might have to get specific with how you're dividing each macro. But that's really fancy. And that's sort of more like the sprinkles of icing on the cake. I don't think it's necessary right out of the bat. I think what matters most is females get the energy intake for the day in, the protein in, and from there, that's going to be 80% of the fight. And then we just tweak it to keep compliance in check. I think that is the best approach, because consistency is going to give us the results. So if every day or every week their schedule is in such a way that trying to eat where I've told them to eat or eat what I've told them to eat is a problem, eventually they're going to fall off the tracks, and then we're going to lose progress. So first things first is get energy intake established, protein intake established, and then from there, I think we just fine tune it to them and what is best for their schedule and compliance.
So you mentioned ideally 3-4 times a day to have a meal. What kind of downfalls would there be possible if someone eats less? Because we have heard quite popular being, hey, if you're fasting, you'll create autophagy and energy and whatever else. Not understanding that training causes autophagy as well. Just go to the gym and you'll have the same exact effect. But so if someone, let's say, doesn't eat half a day and then just have a big meal at night, maybe a little snack in midday, do they really miss out on anything? Or maybe is that just a case of that you will struggle to get enough macronutrients and micronutrients to keep your health in check?
I think there's a few things to consider there. If it's a performance-driven goal or maximizing lean contractile tissue or something like that, they're gonna be at a slight disadvantage just from the protein turnover rate and the nitrogen balance at the end of the day. I don't think it's a major deal. For females that just want to look and feel good, it's not going to matter really much at all. But by principle, they would be at a slight disadvantage if they're only taking in a protein bolus once or twice a day. If body composition and really the retention or accrual of lean contractile tissue is a priority. But there's a lot of health benefits to bouts of intermittent fasting and stuff like that. So it kind of depends on what is their priority. There's nothing wrong with having less meals a day, but they also might run into the problem of if their calculated calories are 1,500 or 2,000, they're not going to have an easy time eating that in one meal. And then oftentimes they're going to then by default create an even bigger deficit because they're just not as physically able to eat all the food. And that's going to become a problem, especially long term, because the body's going to start going through these adaptations again where there's insufficient energy coming in. And so it's going to start down regulating things. So it's really, I think it's going to come down to, again, the compliance thing. If 2 meals is all we can get in, we're going to make it work. Really, I think just fine, unless they're an athlete and they're getting close to the upper level of competition in their chosen sport. I think other than that, 2 meals is going to be fine. One is going to present a little bit more problems for sure. But even then, once in a while, even if it was just like a one day here, one day there, that's irrelevant. But if that was their consistent day-to-day approach, 1 meal a day would be challenging for sure. They would still make progress, but it wouldn't be as good.
Yeah, so from what I hear is 1-2 meals a day probably is applicable for somebody who doesn't train, still possible, but you run into risk of causing malnourishment to begin with. And then what we talked about in previous videos, that you will force your body to adapt to lower amount of food, and your body will try to preserve its life over losing body fat. And you kind of trade off being efficient, healthy to being smaller person.
Yeah, like if the 1 or 2 meals a day forces you to eat less than what we need you to eat, yeah, you're going to go through these adaptations. You could not be malnourished by eating 1 or 2 meals a day, but from a lean contractile tissue accrual or preservation point of view, 1 meal's not ideal. 2 is a little bit better, but again, 2 would be sort of, in my opinion, the minimum if muscle is part of the goal. However you want to define it, gaining some or keeping what you've got. Keeping what you've got should always be important to a female. We need that lean contractile tissue. It's very important for long-term health. And in my opinion, gaining more should also be a priority, but some females don't want to, and that's perfectly fine. But it's going to come down to, again, like we started at the very beginning, we have to understand what the goal is. Like I think the very first video, we talked about the importance of really understanding what your goal is, because that's going to determine a lot of what becomes priority over what doesn't. Context is everything when it comes to that stuff.
So is there any benefit of eating every 2 hours?
From a metabolic point of view, no, not long term. But if you have thousands and thousands of calories you need to get in, eating frequently is going to make that easier. Some people find that more frequent meals are better for their personal compliance. But there's no real additional benefit from a muscular retention or gaining point of view, eating every 2 hours. But sometimes it's necessary just because you have so much food to eat. I have never come across that with a female. They've never had so many calories that they need to be eating every 2 hours, because that's a lot of meals and a lot of food. But no, I don't think it's worth it. I mean, especially when I'm working with professional females, like they can't schedule in every 2 hours a break to eat. So I usually don't see that coming across almost ever with women, for sure.
So when it comes to setting up a goal-specific nutrition plan, does age play a role? What I mean by age is when you are really young and you don't really have much things to worry about, then maybe you start running a business and you're up and running and in your prime years, so to speak, and then approaching menopause and those kind of things. Is there anything that has to be specifically adapted to those kind of settings, or do they still follow the same approach as you have laid out in all previous videos?
Basically, it's basically the same approach. Usually when females are younger, they have more time, they have more ability or flexibility in their day-to-day life, that they can incorporate things a little bit differently or maybe a little easier. It's really going to come down to, it's not an opinion, it's a physiological need that your body will have. And if it needs X amount of food, or X amount of calories, I should say, we need to get that into your body. Whether we agree or we don't, it isn't really the point. So if I have a very busy female and she's on a regimented schedule, or she only has time to eat at these times, then we're forced into feeding her at those times, and that's perfectly fine. People that have a little bit more freedom or flexibility to schedule, they can move things around a little bit, and that can give some benefit, but that can also become problematic too, because a lot of people thrive in routine, and the body actually likes routine. So every time you change something, it causes an inflammatory response, which is not a bad thing unless it's chronic. If all the time you're constantly causing an inflammatory response over and over and over, your body's going to get to this chronic inflammation, and that's going to be a problem. I mean, that's a bit extreme, but it can happen. So I think it's still going to come down to a compliance thing. You want to be able to put the nutrients in the best way for you to be able to do that on a day-to-day basis, because that's just going to improve compliance, and that is going to be, it's not sexy, it's not trendy, it's not fancy, but that's the magic. The magic is consistency.
So when you expand on all this, how specific are you? What type of foods you would suggest for someone to eat? Let's say someone eats for weight loss or someone eats for performance. What I mean by that, would you force somebody, well, not force, encourage someone who's trying to do a really performance-based training to eat something that has extremely fast carbs in post-training, which we see now a lot of, like sugar-loaded cereals and things like that, as opposed to someone who just wants to get leaner? Would they be kind of more encouraged, hey, you eat your whole meal foods afterwards? So is there a difference between those two types of scenarios?
There's a difference, but the difference is only going to become apparent when you're working with extremes, in my opinion. I think a professional female or anybody that wants to look good, feel good, long term, etc., they don't need to worry about meal timing and meal specifics unless they're at that given time. But that would be more like a
Sorry, you break up a little
peri-workout.
bit. Could you repeat after unless they? I lost you for a second.
I can't remember what I was saying about that, but so basically, for most people, I don't think meal timing is overly necessary. I think for women that just want to look good, feel good, long term, they don't need to worry about that. There's nothing saying that they can't, and they can. It'll be fine, but it's not going to be a game changer for them unless they are at a point like we talked about earlier, where they're trying to maximize literally the last little bit of performance they can get. Then meal timing is going to become specific. But when I'm working with professional females that are just looking to feel good and look good, they're not worrying about that. So there's no need. How I determine the calorie breakdown in terms of macronutrients is going to depend on the individual. Protein, like we've said many times now, that has to be there. That's priority. I want that present in every meal. The difference between carbs and fats is going to depend on their compliance, their insulin resistance or sensitivity, their body fat, and their goal, and if it's a performance goal or not. If it's a performance goal, I obviously want to bias some carbs more towards the performance window. But if it's just their performance in terms of the activity they're doing to achieve their aesthetic goal, it doesn't matter. As long as their energy balance is right, they're going to be fine. I think part of the issue with what females are struggling with is they're faced with all these really fancy, complicated, complex, gimmicky meal plans that, oh, you need to eat at this time and that time. Food needs to be, fast acting carb pre-workout, fast acting post. You need a casein protein before bed, blah, blah, blah. I think that's just adding way more unnecessary stress than needed, because it's not going to amount to anything in real world results for someone that just wants to improve body composition and feel good. That stuff is saved, or should be saved, for elite level athletes that need to be at their A game for a given moment. Because even the A level athletes, they don't do that year round. They do that when it matters. Like even when I'm working with professional fighters or aesthetic, like IFBB people, it's not a year round thing. It's when it matters do we get fancier and fancier. But our target audience is just people that want to look good. So if they just want to look good, they don't need to be fancy. They need to be consistent, and the certain strategies need to be there, and that will give them all the results they're looking for, and it'll be a lot easier for them to keep them. And I think that is part of the magic as well.
So eating potato or cereal after training is not going to make difference how fast the glutes grow.
Well, from an acute point of view, if you go train your glutes and then right after eat a whole bunch of carbs and then start posing in the mirror, you're going to have more fullness in your glutes. but it's at that moment. The next morning when you wake up, that's gone again. So if you need to do that for a photo shoot or something, like so I'm saying, like if it's a specific reason, sure, there's reasons you can do this, and it's going to add some benefit. But overall net results, it's not going to be a big deal, assuming their calorie intake is accurate and their macronutrient intake is accurate. But being targeted specific to training, you're really getting to the last percentages of maximizing results. And I think until you have the foundation in place first, all that stuff isn't worth the juice isn't worth the squeeze there. Like you want to make sure first the energy deficit is right, or the energy balance, because if you're not at the right energy balance and you're actually causing the goal, which would be say fat loss, for example, then mealtime is not going to matter shit.
So yeah, it's basically get your basics right and then start to look into can you maximize everything else. Now, going from this, I am interested into how do you look into micronutrients now? Is there some type of foods that you feel like women should include? We already talked about previously that red meat would be a great choice. So where would you kind of look into what kind of micronutrients are necessary for females specifically, and what type of foods would you encourage to have in diets more often than not?
Right off the bat, I would say that if there was a deficiency, the blood test from day one would point that out, and we would need to address that. If it's a deficiency, usually food alone needs to happen, but you usually need to supplement with it. You're trying to get rid of that deficiency as quickly as possible. If we don't have a deficiency via a blood test, then I'm going to just try to cover all my bases with choosing wholesome foods in general, with a few exceptions like we talked about. I do think females should have red meat. It's their number one source of iron. If they're menstruating, they are losing iron every month. This is a very common deficiency in females. B12, zinc, magnesium, these are common deficiencies in women, all of which are dealt with by animal proteins, which is why I emphasize animal proteins. If I am working with a female, and I do, that is a vegetarian or a vegan even, we can overcome these. It just takes a little bit more detail, a little bit more meticulous tracking, which they're probably already used to, given their choice of how they want to be eating, but it does add more workload to them. But in general, if they're eating across the board 80% the way we've talked about, wholesome, nutritious foods, if they don't have a deficiency, they're not going to get one. The problem then arises when we are working in an energy deficit via caloric intake, for example. So let's say your maintenance calories was whatever, 1,800, 2,000. We said, okay, we're going to put a 500 calorie a day deficit in place. Now you're down to 13 or 1,500, whatever. There's going to come a time where if the goal requires a big enough energy deficit, that the amount of food you can eat to stay within that energy intake will cause a deficiency if it's done long enough. A bikini prep is common. That's a common place for that to happen, because the level of leanness they need to achieve almost always requires an energy intake that's below ideal, or that energy availability threshold that we talked about a few videos ago. At that point, then you have to be careful of micronutrient deficiencies, and that's when food choices become more and more specific. But that's one of those things that I think you address as needed. I would never say to a female that's 20% body fat that they need to eat chicken and green beans at every meal. To me, that's ridiculous. They're in no risk of any deficiencies if they don't already have one, if they're eating calories they need for a goal, even the goal is fat loss. If they're 20% body fat, their caloric intake is still going to be relatively high. There will be no risk of nutrient deficiencies at that point. I would say once you start dipping below that, depending on body weight, but once you start dipping below that 1,300-ish calorie intake per day, you don't really need to worry about deficiencies if your food choices make sense. But there's going to come a scenario where you will likely need to add some supplements to supplement the foods that you're not eating. And the only reason you shouldn't be eating those foods is if your energy intake doesn't allow, because you just don't have the caloric room. Other than that, it's not something that they need to be concerned about. With certain exceptions, like we talked about, like if they're relatively extremely lean and need to reduce their energy take very much, or vegans, etc., vegetarians, they need to be a little bit more specific on how they do things, and they might need supplementation right off the bat. But even with supplements, which I think we'll talk about in future videos, even with supplements, you don't want to be just guessing. Like, you want to have some form of measurement to assure yourself that, yes, my supplemental program is working, or yes, I have a deficiency, or no, I don't. Like, you don't want to just be throwing vitamins and minerals and stuff at your body, because you can actually cause problems.
So let's touch up on that a little bit. When you have goal-specific nutrition, is there any kind of supplements that you can advise all across the board? Let's say multivitamin or creatine or whey protein, caffeine, the most common ones. What about those? Would there be something that you would say, hey, yes, this is useful?
Realistically, actually, that's not true. Theoretically, no, there is no for sure vitamin you need. Realistically, every single time there's a couple that almost always come up, and usually it's an essential fatty acid supplement of some sort. If they're not eating fatty fish on a regular, they're going to need to supplement a fish oil or a fatty acid supplement of some sort. And I found, with my experience anyways, many females aren't eating a lot of fattier fish, like salmon, red tuna, mackerel, trout, etc. So we want to supplement that. Even if you are eating fatty fish on occasion, supplementing with some essential fatty acid is never going to be a bad thing. You're not going to overdo it. So I don't want to say I always, but I almost always suggest an essential fatty acid supplement. Where I live, we have 4 seasons. I'm finding myself almost always suggesting vitamin D as well. I would prefer they get outside, but in the winter, even when they're outside, the lack of sunlight does add up, and vitamin D supplementation becomes important. The bioavailability of vitamin D supplementations is not very good, but it's still pretty much harmless unless you are really, really overdoing it, which you're not if you're my client. It's foolproof. So on average, I would say I'm always suggesting an essential fatty acid and vitamin D. Kind of stops there. Blood test right off the beginning, if I see iron or ferritin issues, something like that, we may suggest a iron supplement, but that depends on how they're going to be eating. If they're going to be eating the way I suggest, I don't need it. It'll take care of itself. If their goal is to increase lean contractile tissue of some sort, I think creatine monohydrate is one of the only things you have if you're a natural athlete. They've been studying that since the 80s. It's pretty much bulletproof. You can't go wrong. I always tell my clients, if they implement creatine monohydrate, or any creatine really, they're probably going to see a bit of water retention at first, some water weight. It's meant to happen. It's a good thing. It's also temporary. Let it go. But other than that, there's not really anything specific that should be across the board. I don't consider whey protein a supplement in a way. It's actually food, in my opinion. Like, it is protein, although it's processed. In my opinion, the least processed foods you can eat overall, the better. Obviously, you can have processed foods. It's not going to be a big deal. But if you're living on them, you're just getting a sub-quality food. So I limit protein powders to clients to if they need them. It's better to eat food. If you can't eat food, it's better to supplement with protein than not get it in at all. It's kind of like one of those tier of importance.
So I want to just take you a little bit back around your iron. So what would be your food suggestions for somebody who has low iron? And we know that if someone is, let's say, insulin resistant, they will get into problems where the iron might be really high. So is there something that you would suggest, hey, okay, then add some spinach in your food, that would be a really good choice for you? And also following up on your protein afterwards, what do you think about protein bars? So let's start with iron first.
If I have a female, I have had one, that's not true. I've had a handful of females that have hemochromatosis, which is going to be high iron all the time. That's a very specific scenario. High iron foods obviously are not good. Regular blood work is very important. That's a niche scenario. It's not super common. Other than that, pretty much every single female is going to be on the lower end of iron, if not even anemic. So that's the most common. That's what 99% of the listeners are going to be dealing with, lower side of iron. And for that, the best remedy food-wise is red and green. Red meats, green vegetables. If they're not willing to eat red meats, they're left with green vegetables. The heme iron in the animal meat is just more bioavailable. So your body's just going to have a better job, do a better job of absorbing that. So it's going to be more effective. And that would be the answer.
Can you just expand on why iron is so essential for female performance for everyone?
Well, it is one of the essential ions in our body. Now, you can have too much and it's very toxic. But if you have low iron, you're basically anemic. And what's going to happen is your body's ability to basically provide oxygen to your muscles and all that stuff, it's just going to be completely hindered. It's very important, and females are constantly losing it if they're menstruating regularly. So that's why it's more common to see them on the lower end than the hemochromatosis higher end. So it should be something that they should be monitoring all the time, but only blood work will do that. But in general, if they are menstruating regularly, they should just know they're fine to be eating iron. If they had hemochromatosis, they would have known from probably childhood. So if they're regularly menstruating, make sure you're eating iron-rich foods. If you're not sure or you want to have a better handle on it, just get your blood work checked.
Yeah, and now the big one, protein bars.
That's actually a really good question. And I think about this in different ways. All the people that are fabricating protein powders and protein bars and all these things, they're making profit. They have to be, they're a business. They're also legally allowed to have an error margin on their label of 20 to 30%. I tell all my clients, if you take a protein bar, it's going to say 20 grams of protein. And then if it's one of those fucking keto bars or whatever it is, either be more carbs or less carbs, lots of fiber or little fiber. Like that'll all depend on the brand you're buying. But I would take that 20-gram protein and I would right away assume it's less, because there's 4 calories per gram of protein. There's 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are sugar, very cheap. Protein is very expensive. They can easily skew those ratios within their allotted margin, their allotted error margin, and they're not doing anything wrong but making more profit. And I would bet they are on purpose doing that all the time. So right off the bat, I think they should assume the protein intake they're getting is lower than what it says. Their carb intake is higher than what it says. I just assume that. Whether I'm right or wrong, I'll never know. But you can't go wrong thinking that way, in my opinion, because a little bit more protein is not a problem. And then from there, it's just another processed food. So is it good in a pinch? I think it's better than going low on protein, but I don't think it's ideal to be living off those things because A, the error margin makes it a little bit more challenging for you to be accurate with your consistent caloric intake. And B, it's processed foods. So at the end of the day, it's just never ideal to be eating something that's processed versus wholesome butcher, vegetable produce aisle in the grocery store. But it's not a bad thing. And some of my clients live on them for a meal of the day. If I have a female that is very busy at work and 3 or 4 meals a day is what we desire to be ideal, but she doesn't have time to sit during work for one of them, that protein bar or protein shake is a good way to get the food in quickly and move on. Or maybe you just carry one with you if you are running behind or stuck in traffic or something goes on, that you can at least make sure your protein intake is there. But I think they should be reserved for almost like emergency situations. And if emergency means compliance, then okay, I'll buy that. But if they're using them on the regular day to day, I think they would get better results if they didn't. but that's going to be one of those things that you can't really measure unless you can clone them and, you know, have two people doing the same thing, or have two the same people doing one of each methods and then seeing, but that's not happening. So I like them as an emergency backup. That's kind of where I stand on those. And again, I still think the error margin should be considered. I don't believe you're getting what you say, what it says you're getting from the protein point of view. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I just find that sometimes people get some like stomach issues with certain brands of
yes,
protein bars, and then they end up just having a hard time on getting used to eating whole foods afterwards. So they crave that palatability a lot. Then that kind
I
of
have seen that. Yeah, I've
snowballs
seen
out.
that. And I think that oftentimes comes down to the artificial sweeteners they're using in those bars.
Mm.
Um, and it's going to be depending on the individual. I am trying to always encourage my clients to not eat things that's causing them any sort of digestive issues. But even still, I'd rather they had a digestive issue temporarily and maintain their protein intake than not. But if they were constantly eating something that's disrupting digestion in any way, I don't think that's ideal. It is going to be hindering your body's ability to absorb the nutrients you're consuming. But at the end of the day, I think that's going to be not as common as it may seem. But again, I don't think you should be living on the processed foods. Anyways, there's a lot of protein powders that do the same thing for clients. And usually they find they go, I actually prefer a whey blend because it's the least processed whey protein powder. But you'll see people say, well, I need an isolate. Well, a lot of people, the isolate bothers them. They say, well, then I need to get the, why am I blanking here? I just had it. That'll come back to me anyways. There's a further processed protein. It's just the digestibility is even easier. But again, it's just because it's further processed.
It's hydrolyzed.
Yeah, hydrolyzed. So they're paying a premium for the hydrolyzed whey. It's probably the least quality of the proteins, but they can digest it. Where if they would just spend a little bit of time and having some food ready, there's going to be lots of foods they can eat and digest, and it'll probably be cheaper and definitely better long term.
It's interesting you mentioned the kind of whey blend, because I did a little experiment on my blood glucose, and only things that messes it up is whey protein.
Right. And is it
And
specific ones? Is it the blend? Is it an isolate? Or
no, it's just whey protein. And if I don't go for a walk after I had whey protein shake, I'll just want to fall asleep.
You crash, yeah.
Yeah. I know I can eat jam sandwiches and nothing's going to happen, but if I have whey protein, I'm just out. And it doesn't matter if it's with carbs, without carbs, or whatnot. It's just whey protein.
Wow.
But yeah, we can I think summarize this one and wrap it up, because there's quite a lot to digest. So basically, when you're going for goal specific stuff, understand that you need to know how active you actually are. So maybe some kind of tracking is essential. You know, your daily steps or exercise, like you said, knowing exactly what you're doing in the gym might be very useful for this. Then making sure that you have probably more than 2 meals a day is better than not. And it depends on your daily lifestyle. And if you are someone who is on a smaller side and approach that limit of 1,300 calories per day, this is where you might start running into issues of malnourishment and need to take more careful look into what you eat, and maybe more frequent blood tests than someone who is in range of 1,500 to 2,000 calories a day. And most frequent supplements would always be essential fatty acids, vitamin D. This is funny you mentioned about vitamin D. Even I supplement with vitamin D. I go outside and spend a lot of time there, and I'm still on a low end a lot of times.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this was very useful. Unless you want to add something, I'm happy to wrap it up and expand on more stuff in the next videos.
Yeah, no, that sounds great.
Awesome, Scott. Thank you for your time, and I'll catch with you next video.
Yep, thank you.